Hello, and welcome back to Conquering Finale. My name is Jason Lafredo, and I'm excited we get to do another spotlight on plugins today. We're looking at the Patterson Parenthesize Trill-to Notes plugin, which does exactly what you would think it would do. And in the plugins menu, if you have the Patterson plugins, they will appear here, and the Parenthesize Trill-to Notes plugin is right here. It is currently grayed out because you do have to have something selected in order to use it. If you do not have the Patterson plugins, it is a third-party set of plugins. You have to purchase it, and I will put a description in the links so that you can do that if you want. Now what this plugin does is it basically creates these notes that would go to the right of the main notes when you have these trills. Now the main thing that you have to realize is that the plugin just won't pull these out of thin air. So it's not going to be able to just look at the trill here, and see that it's a flat and know that it has to put a B flat there or a C sharp here. So you do have to give the plugin a little bit more information than what's in these two measures. And the information that it needs is actually grace notes. It uses grace notes to turn them into these trill-to notes. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but the grace notes actually have to go before the notes. The plugin will remove the stem, parenthesize them, and also reposition them to after the notes. So that's what you need to do. You actually have to set it up in a specific way in order to get this to work. So I'm just going to recreate these two measures in the next two measures in the way that you need to do this. So again, it's counterintuitive, but put the grace note before the main note, and this is going to be the trill-to note that's actually going to go after. So I'll just set this up real quick, just reproduce this, grace note first and then the main note, so that you get something that looks like this. Now this is obviously not the way it's going to look at the end, and let's just do something here. Let's use my filter here. I've already got it set up, and we'll copy and paste those trill markings. All right, so what the plugin is going to do, you select these measures and it's going to turn those grace notes into those trill-to notes. So where is it? Patterson Parenthesize Trill-to Notes. And this is the plugin you get, and it's usually set up, oops, sorry about that. It's usually set up exactly like this out of the bat. There's a bunch of stuff going on here, which I will talk about later in this video. Some of these things are kind of handy and interesting to use, but basically it's kind of easy to do this. And really all you have to know is that you just have to pick the correct grace note duration to modify. In this case, I've made these grace notes eighth notes, so you do have to make sure that eighth notes is selected, and you see you have other options for different types of grace notes. Depending on what you're doing, you can actually use this to your advantage, and I'll show you that in a second. But just very simply, just select eighth notes. You can also do this by EDU number, so technically it's possible to actually use dotted eighth notes or something if you know the number. But anyway, again, it's just simple. Select eighth notes, press go, and the first thing that's going to happen the first time you run this plugin is going to give you this warning: to store data within a document, a new expression category called Pat plugin data will be created. Please do not modify it or use it for other purposes. So, it is what it is. It's going to create an expression category. Just ignore it. It's there. Don't modify it, but just click OK and you're good to go. And once you do that, you'll see that it's going to take all of those grace notes, flip them to the other side, remove the stem, and then create parentheses around it, right? There is a couple things going on here, though. Right off the bat, something weird happens. The spacing is weird. So there's a lot of space before this G. There's a lot of space before this B. The reason for that is that the plugin doesn't respace these measures. It kind of can't because of what it's doing. It's actually just manually moving these grace notes, but the spacing still exists as if the grace notes were there. And this does cause some issues if you go ahead and do something like respace your document. You'll see what happens is that it's going to take those parenthesized notes and place them back where they should be if they were grace notes. So there's some weird stuff going on, and I'm just going to show you sort of the best way to do this, in my opinion, where you don't have those types of situations. So I'm going to go back to these first two original measures. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off my auto music spacing and auto update layout in the preferences, in the Finale preferences. This will prevent Finale from automatically spacing when I add those grace notes. And in my opinion, the best thing to do is to do this last, like the last thing you're going to do in your document. Just hold off on putting these things until you've got all the other music filled out and all that stuff, and then insert these grace notes. And the way that you kind of have to force Finale to insert extra beats here and then add the grace notes, it's a little bit of a pain, but I think this is a better situation. So just bear with me. I'm going to actually do some crazy stuff here where I'm going to insert some grace notes here. I may fast forward this a little bit. All right, and you can see what I've done. I've inserted those grace notes, and because I have the music spacing turned off, it's not spacing these, so everything's sort of overlapping. This is not looking the way that you would want it to look. However, when you run that plugin now with the grace notes not spaced like this, what's going to happen is that it's going to put those notes on the other side, so there's plenty of room for them, and obviously the spacing is correct now. There's not that wide gap at the beginning and all that stuff. So this is sort of, in my opinion, the best way to go about this is to do this last, turn off your auto music spacing, and then go about your business with this plugin. You do have to realize, though, that once you have these in here, if you make some other changes, if you go in here and you make some changes to these measures, with the auto music spacing turned on, obviously it's going to screw up, but also if you just respace everything, it's going to get screwed up as well. So you do have to be super, super careful. And one extra thing that you can do if you want is to go into the music spacing options here for grace notes. There's an option here to keep current, and this will basically make the finale ignore the grace notes when you apply music spacing. So now I can do that same thing, select all music spacing, and it will reset the music spacing without resetting those grace notes back to the left side of the note. So that's another sort of way around this. Of course, if you actually have grace notes that need to be spaced, you might have to kind of come in here a little bit and go back and forth between these two options. But between that and turning off automatic music spacing, you can kind of avoid some of these weird things where you have a lot of extra space or the things get undone, all that stuff. So although the plugin kind of works really well to do what it does, you just have to be aware of the grace note spacing going forward. Now there are scenarios where you might have something like this where you actually do have grace notes here, right? So what would you do? You can't actually use eighth note grace notes before the B and the C here, and then use the plugin with eighth notes, because it will turn these notes into the Trill-To notes as well. So the way around this is to actually use a different value for the grace notes, and you can choose anything from quarter to 64th note. So I'm just going to go in here and just demonstrate this. I'm actually going to create quarter note grace notes, so hang with me here. I may fast forward. And just like that, you'll see that I've got my quarter note grace notes, which you can do indeed. And now what I can do is select these measures here, and instead of using eighth notes, I can use quarter notes, and it will only change the quarter note grace notes. So it's going to leave the eighth notes alone. So this is a nice little feature to filter out the actual grace notes, right? You just kind of have to be clever about that and know which duration you want to do here. There are occasions when you have situations like this where the trill is actually in the middle of a beamed set of grouped notes here. One thing you have to be aware of is that you can't use quarter notes in this scenario. If you want to keep these notes beamed, the quarter notes won't allow you to beam the notes together. So in this case, you might have to do something like 30-second notes. So we can do that here. I'm just going to insert a 30-second note. And when you do this and turn that into a grace note, you will actually have to reattach your beams, and so now you can see that I've got this scenario, and now I can go in here and say just turn the 30-second notes grace notes into the parenthesized trill notes, and it will do just that, and it will leave alone the eighth note grace note here that's an actual grace note. Now, when you have chords, a few interesting things happen. So I've got chords set up in different ways here. When you have chords in the same layer, what's going to happen here, let me just show you. Go to eighth notes and go. You'll see that you'll get the parenthesized notes, but you'll get one set of parentheses. This is the way the plugin works. It's not going to create two separate parentheses for both of those notes. When you use layers, however, it will. So when we do it over here, you can see that you are creating two sets of parentheses, one in each layer. Now sometimes it gets a little wonky because the grace notes or the parentheses are actually going to overlap. For something like this is probably fine, but just be aware that this is the scenario of how this works. Now, it's going to be weird when you have, more notes like this bar right here. If we try and do this, it's going to look really weird because you're only going to get one parentheses on this triad here, which doesn't quite look right. I mean, I suppose you could actually set up a separate set of parentheses that are taller and fix that way. And obviously this is completely weird. And you know, I should point out that you probably would never want to do this for a piano player anyway. This is actually impossible to play. But one sort of workaround, some funny workaround for this is to actually do this in separate layers. So I've got layers 1, 2, and 3. It all looks like it's a one chord. And after you run the plugin, you'll see that you'll get, you know, it'll look like one chord, but then you'll have 3 sets of parentheses here. So this is a sort of an interesting workaround. I've set all of the stems to go down, so they're sort of overlapping and they kind of look okay. So, you know, if you really need to do that, again, don't ever give this to a pianist with one hand because this is impossible. All right, so that's the basic usage of this plugin. There's a bunch of other options here that I want to start talking about. I'm going to skip this one, modify all grace notes. I'm going to talk about that last. Let's talk about the unlink buttons here. Now, when you first run this plugin in any file, this is actually going to say link, and if I press unlink, you'll see that it will go back to link. Now, what this does is it allows you to link a specific articulation to the left parentheses and the right parentheses. And if we actually press that link button, you're going to pull up your articulation selection window. Now, Finale comes with left and right parentheses, but you don't want to use these because the plugin needs to have the articulation set up in a very specific way as far as position goes. So here's the original one, and you'll see the thing that's really important is this positioning, vertical positioning. It says always note head side. The plugin can't work with this parentheses character set up like this. So it creates its own where this is actually set to manual. So it's really a good idea just to let the plugin create its own thing. And you can, if you want, link your own thing to it, but it gets complicated. You know, honestly, once it does it, you can actually go in here and edit this if you really want. If you want it to be a little bit bigger, you can change the size in the set font, or, you know, if you can find a square bracket or something, you can do it that way as well. But you know, the best thing to do is just let the plugin create these and then just use those. They look pretty good. There's no reason to really do much with those. When you do have this unlinked, you do get this font option. This will only appear if one of these or both of them are unlinked, and this will allow you to set the font that's going to be used for these little parentheses. Once you link both of them, then you don't have that option anymore. These are the characters that are going to be used in this plugin from now on in this particular file. You do have these offsets, and this is exactly what you'd think they are. These are the left and right and up and down offsets for the parentheses articulations on the left and right side of the small notes there. And, you know, this works like anything else. Negative numbers go left in horizontal, positive numbers go right, negative number go down, positive goes up in the vertical. You know, the way that the plugin is set up automatically, this works pretty well, but if you wanted a little extra space, you can, you know, insert these, you know, make these values a little bit larger. I'm not even going to get into this, but you can play with that if you want. The space between edges of main note and trill-to note is exactly that. It's this edge, the right edge of the notes here, and the left edge of the parentheses. That's this value here. You can change that if you want more space, less space, whatever. And then there's one option here, additional separation when stem is on right. This is sometimes handy for scenarios where you have a trill on an eighth note, because these flags take up a lot of horizontal space. So if I were to just run this plugin on this measure in particular, you'll notice that the parenthesized notes actually kind of overlap with the flag. So in a scenario like this, it might actually be good to just add a little bit of extra separation there, and then that will allow that pitch to go a little bit farther to the right. You know, there's a lot of rests going on here, so you're gonna have to, you know, probably manually respace some of this anyway, but that's the idea. Just be aware that this value applies to stems on the right, whether there's a flag there or not. So, you know, if you do it over here with that extra value, you're gonna get the same result, and you're gonna have a really wide separation here. So, you know, sometimes you need to add this, sometimes it's not worth adding. So let's just go back and make that 0 again. So there's two options here, reset note heads and unforce hidden accidentals. This is actually kind of undoing some of the old ways that we used to deal with this. There were some note heads, and I actually kind of did them over here, that had parentheses around them, and there's some workarounds. You would remove the stem and move the thing and blah, 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 and it was kind of complicated. This plugin sort of makes it a lot easier, But occasionally you run into these old files and they have these weird things with the note heads. Sometimes you're force hiding accidentals to do other weird things. But anyway, this plugin can just simply undo both of those things with both of them selected. And in fact, honestly, just leave them both checked. It's not going to matter, because if there are no hidden accidentals, it's not going to unforce hiding them. You know what I mean? So whether or not these are checked or not is probably fine. Just, leave them checked. It's probably totally fine. There is this option to reposition only. So if you have some of these Trill-To Notes here, and you check this, first of all, these two options are gonna go away, because you're not actually creating new ones, but you can respace anything. So if you just wanted to, again, just add a little extra space here for whatever reason, you can do that, and you'll see the upstem versions will go a little bit farther to the right. So with this option, you can simply reposition them, and I think this will work on the offsets as well. So that's what that would do. And then finally, this flag note spacing plugin. This is a bit of a longer conversation. Patterson has another plugin called Note Spacing, which is basically his own version of Finale's note spacing. It's pretty complicated, deserving of its own video at some point. But one thing that this plugin can do is actually isolate specific measures to not be spaced, or to be spaced in a very specific way. So you can set up your whole score so that individual measures are spaced differently, including ignoring grace notes for music spacing. So it's possible to actually set these up so that the grace notes are ignored in this particular scenario. And so this little option here will, in a way, will figure out how to flag that measure so that it will be recognized by this plugin. If you use the regular music spacing plugin, then this has no effect. You have to use the Patterson note spacing plugin for this to mean anything. But it's a much longer conversation, totally other video to cover. So, but that's the gist of it. We do have the options of saving the settings, and this was kind of cool when you do this. I'm not going to do it now, but you can add a setting. It'll just remember what these settings are, and then you have these options to skip the dialogue. You can use the submenu. Basically what happens is that once you do that, you go into the Patterson plugins, and the Parenthesize Trill Notes gets a submenu here, and then you can choose any of those settings that you have. So if you have these set up in a certain way where you're just doing eighth notes, just doing quarter notes, if you're doing it with extra space here, you can set those up individually, and you can get pretty complex with this and do a lot of things with that. But that's what the save settings options are. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about was this modify all grace notes with this duration option. Now this is pretty unique. What you have to understand is that the plugin only turns the grace notes into these Trill-To notes if the grace note is attached to a main note. So if you look at this measure here, these first two grace notes are attached to the F sharp and the D here. This last grace note I've put in at the end of the measure. It's not attached to this D, it's sort of attached to the bar line, I guess. But also there's a rest in the next measure. So it's not like this grace note goes into another beat. What's handy is that the plugin with this option unchecked will ignore these types of grace notes that don't have a main partner, right? So if I check go with the plugin, you'll see that it will turn these two into the Trill-To notes, but it will leave that one alone. However, with this option checked, what's really cool is that you've added a little bit of functionality here in that you can actually turn that into one of these Trill-To notes, and when we press go, you'll see that happen. And the added bonus is that what it doesn't do is it doesn't change the positioning of it. It actually leaves it exactly where it is. And I've set this up exactly like this with the glissando, because with this option checked, basically you can have a Gliss-To note, and that's exactly what happened here. So we turned that grace note, which was sort of, stuck on the end of this measure, and we turned that into a gliss note. And you have to have this option checked in order to do that, because again, this note, it doesn't have a partner. And because it doesn't have a partner, it doesn't get flipped to the other side of it. So just a little extra functionality with that option, which I think is really cool if you have a scenario like this. All right, and that is everything. That's the Parenthesize Trill-To Notes plugin from Patterson. If you do this sort of thing, it's really, really handy. I highly recommend getting this plugin. And like I said, it's pretty simple to use most of the time. You just have to kind of learn to manage the spacing scenarios. And again, you can adjust the music spacing to, keep current with grace note spacing so that you don't undo all of these things later on. And of course, it's really important to make sure that your automatic music spacing is turned off when you get to this point where you're adding these Trill-To notes. So other than that, it's fairly simple to use. Just select the measures, make sure you have the right duration, press go, and you're good to go. It's a really nifty plugin with some extra options that are available, and yeah, I highly recommend it. All right, so that's it for the Patterson Parenthesize Trill-To Notes. I hope this has been helpful. I hope you've learned something, and so there you go. I don't know what the next spotlight on plugins is going to be, but I'm sure it will be equally enjoyable and useful. So we'll see what that is. Once again, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. As always, please, please, please subscribe if you haven't done so, and I will see you soon on the next video.